The day Evan Carter turned 18, the state stopped pretending it cared what happened to him. There was no cake, no card, no goodbye speech from the staff. Just a plastic bin with 2 changes of clothes, a pair of worn sneakers, and a thin envelope with his name typed across the front. His whole childhood, reduced to something that could fit under one arm. Mia stood beside him in the hallway of the group home, her fingers wrapped around the sleeve of his jacket. At 14, she still had 4 years before the system was supposed to let her go. But everyone knew what that really meant. 4 years of waiting, 4 years of being moved from room to room like a piece of furniture. Evan had already decided. Wherever he went, Mia went too. "Don't mess this up, Carter," the director said, arms folded tight against her chest. "You're responsible for her now." Evan nodded. He didn't trust his voice. In a small office that smelled like old coffee and paper, a lawyer named Mr. Whitmore slid the envelope across the desk. He was gray-haired and slow-moving, the kind of man who looked like he had spent his life reading other people's problems. "This is from your grandfather," he said. Evan blinked. "I didn't have a grandfather." "You did," Whitmore replied gently. "Henry Carter. He passed away years ago. Left something for you and your sister." Inside the envelope was a deed. 500 acres of land in a rural county Evan had never heard of. Along with it, a rusted key taped to a yellowed note. Whitmore sighed. "I should be honest with you. The land isn't much. The house collapsed years ago. No utilities. The only structure left is an old Quonset hut, basically a metal storage building. The soil's poor. No one's farmed it in decades. So it's worthless," Evan said. "On paper, mostly?" Mia leaned forward. "Can we go there?" Whitmore hesitated. "You can. It's yours." That night, Evan lay awake on the bus, staring at the key in his palm. It felt heavier than it should have, like it was tied to something he couldn't see yet. Mia pressed her forehead to the window, watching the city fade into fields and open sky. She smiled. "It looks like freedom." By the time they arrived, the town was little more than a gas station and a blinking traffic light. A dirt road led them 5 miles into tall grass and broken fences. The old farmhouse was just a skeleton of wood and stone, swallowed by weeds. Only the chimney still stood, like a memory refusing to fall down. Behind it sat the Quonset hut. Long, curved, rust-stained, a metal scar in the middle of an empty field. Mia whispered, "That's it?" "That's it," Evan said. The padlock groaned when he turned the key. The door scraped open with a sound that echoed across the land. Inside were dusty tools, old crates, and shadows thick enough to hide a lifetime. Mia stepped in first. "It's big," she said softly. Evan followed her, his chest tight. This place wasn't a gift, it was a question. And whatever answer it held, it was waiting for them under this roof of rust and silence. The inside of the Quonset hut smelled like rust and old rain. Dust floated in the air when Evan stepped forward, drifting through thin beams of sunlight that leaked in through the curved windows near the ceiling. Everything looked frozen in time. Farm tools leaning against the wall, wooden crates stacked crookedly, and heavy tarps draped over machines that hadn't moved in years. Mia walked slowly, her sneakers crunching over grit and pebbles. "It's like a museum," she whispered, "but for someone nobody remembers." Evan ran his hand across a workbench. His fingers came away gray. He tried to picture the grandfather he'd never known, Henry Carter, standing in this place, working alone while the rest of the world forgot him. They searched for anything useful, food, blankets, something they could sell. All they found were broken tools and empty jars. After nearly an hour, the excitement drained into disappointment. Then Mia stopped near the far wall. "Evan, look." The concrete floor beneath her feet was different. A square section, lighter in color, perfectly cut. No cracks. No weeds pushing through it like the rest of the slab. Evan knelt down and brushed away dirt. A thin seam outlined the square. "That's not normal," he said. He pressed down. Nothing happened. He slid his fingers along the edge until he felt something small and metal, a recessed ring hidden under dust. He hooked a finger into it and pulled. The slab lifted with a deep, aching groan, like something waking up after a long sleep. Cold air rose from below. A dark hole opened in the floor. Mia's voice shook. "Is that a basement?" "More like a hiding place." Evan grabbed an old flashlight from a shelf. It flickered twice before turning on. He aimed the beam downward. At the bottom of the shallow pit sat a single object, a dark green metal box, military style, locked with a combination dial. Mia leaned closer. "What is it?" "I don't know," Evan said, "but it's the only thing down there." He climbed in and lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked. When he set it on the floor, the metal made a dull, final sound. They stared at the lock. "Do you think there's money in it?" Mia asked. Evan shook his head. If there was, the lawyer would have mentioned it. Mia suddenly pointed upward. "Wait." She shined the flashlight on the underside of the concrete slab. Scratched into the cement were 6 numbers. A date. Their mother's birthday. Evan felt his chest tighten. He knew he'd remember that. His hands trembled as he turned the dial. Right, left, right. Click. The latch released. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Evan lifted the lid. There was no cash, no gold, no jewelry. Only envelopes. Dozens of them, all tied together with twine. Each one addressed in careful handwriting. To Evan and Mia. Beneath the letters lay a thick ledger book and a small cassette tape wrapped in oilcloth. Mia picked up one envelope. "He wrote to us?" Evan opened the top letter. "My dear Evan," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are grown. I am sorry I was never there. I stayed away to keep you safe." Evan swallowed hard and kept reading. Henry Carter wrote about a company called Blackridge Industries, about how they wanted to buy his land years ago to bury toxic waste beneath it, about how he fought them and lost, about how, after Evan and Mia's parents died, Blackridge came back with an offer. Walk away, let the land rot, and they would leave the children alone. "So he gave up the land for us," Mia whispered. "But not the truth," Evan said. The ledger was filled with names, dates, chemical codes. Proof, evidence. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a burden. Outside, the wind pushed against the rusted walls of the hut, making it groan. Evan closed the box slowly. "They didn't just leave us dirt," he said. "They left us a secret." Mia hugged her arms. "And secrets don't stay buried." Evan looked at the floor where the trapdoor waited. For the first time since leaving the group home, he understood something clearly. This land wasn't empty. It was dangerous. And someone out there might still want it back. They didn't sleep much that night. The Quonset hut made small, restless noises as the temperature dropped. Metal popping, wind slipping through cracks, something unseen brushing against the walls. Evan lay awake on an old canvas tarp, staring at the dark curve of the ceiling. The letters were stacked beside him in their metal box, heavy with a truth he hadn't asked for. Mia finally broke the silence. "Do you think they're still out there?" Evan knew who she meant. "Blackridge," he said quietly. "Yeah, I think they are." The next morning, a car came down the dirt road. It wasn't a farm truck or a delivery van. It was long, black, and polished, the kind of car that didn't belong in a field full of weeds. It rolled to a stop near the collapsed farmhouse. A man stepped out wearing a tailored suit and shoes too clean for gravel. He smiled like someone used to being believed. "Evan Carter," he called. Evan moved in front of Mia without thinking. "That's me." The man held out a hand. "My name is Daniel Price. I represent a group of investors interested in rural properties like this one." Evan didn't shake his hand. Price glanced around the land, then back at Evan. "This place is rough, but we'd like to make you an offer. Cash. Today." He opened his briefcase and turned it so Evan could see the contract inside. $2 million. Mia gasped. "That's more money than we've ever seen," she whispered. Price smiled wider. "Exactly. Enough to buy a house, get an education, start fresh. You don't owe this land anything." Evan felt his heart pounding in his ears. $2 million meant safety. It meant Mia wouldn't have to grow up in shelters and borrowed rooms. It meant he could stop pretending he knew how to take care of her. "Why now?" Evan asked. Price shrugged. "Timing." Evan thought of the ledger, the letters, the trap door in the floor. "You said the land was worthless," Evan said. "So why pay this much?" Price's smile thinned. "Because sometimes investors make mistakes. We'd rather make this one go away." That afternoon, Evan and Mia sat inside the hut with the metal box between them. "We could leave," Mia said. "We could just take the money and go." Evan nodded slowly. "We could." "And then what happens to the poison?" she asked. "What happens to the people who don't know?" Evan had no answer. 2 days later, the phone at the gas station rang for him. The voice on the other end was sharp and cold. "This is Blackridge Industries," the woman said. "Mr. Price was generous. That offer is now off the table. Our new offer is $500,000 and a non-disclosure agreement. You will sign it, or you will lose your guardianship of your sister." Evan's hand tightened around the receiver. "You don't even have a home," she continued. "The state will decide you're unfit. Think carefully." That night, Evan sat outside the hut, staring at the dark fields. "I don't know how to fight them," he said. Mia sat beside him, hugging her knees. But Grandpa did. Evan went back inside and opened the metal box again. He dialed the number on the lawyer's card. Mr. Whitmore, he said when the old man answered. We found something under the floor. There was a long silence after Evan explained. Finally, Whitmore spoke. Henry never quit. He just waited. What do we do now? Evan asked. We tell the truth, Whitmore said, before they bury it again. Evan looked at Mia. She nodded once. They were tired. They were scared. But they weren't invisible anymore. And Blackridge had just reminded them why the secret had been hidden in the first place. Mr. Whitmore didn't waste time. By the next morning, he was already making calls. First to a journalist he trusted, then to a state environmental office. Evan and Mia stayed in a small roadside motel in town, a place with flickering lights and a soda machine that never worked. It wasn't much, but it felt safer than the open land. Inside their room, the metal box sat on the bed like a quiet witness. They spent hours scanning pages at the public library. The ledger, the affidavits, the letters. Evan's hands shook as he fed each page into the machine, watching the past turn into digital files. Mia kept a list, checking off every document like it was homework. Do you think they'll really care? She asked. They'll care if people see it, Evan said. A week later, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Mr. Price. It was a woman with a voice like broken glass. You're making a serious mistake, Evan Carter. These accusations could ruin lives. You already ruined some, Evan replied. There was a pause. Our final offer is $500,000, she said. Sign the agreement. Walk away. Your sister stays with you. Evan looked at Mia across the room. She was holding one of their grandfather's letters. No, he said. We're done being quiet. The call ended. 2 days later, the article went live. A headline about illegal dumping and a forgotten farmer appeared on the front page of a national paper. Henry Carter's name was there. So was Blackridge Industries. The story showed photos of the ledger, quotes from the affidavits, and maps of poisoned land. The phone didn't stop ringing. Some people called to threaten, others called to thank them. State investigators drove out to the property. They wore boots and carried clipboards. They took soil samples and photographs. News vans parked near the broken farmhouse like metal animals feeding on the story. Evan stood beside the Quonset hut, watching cameras point toward the land. I didn't think it would be like this, he said. Mia squeezed his hand. Grandpa did. Blackridge's lawyers fought back. They called the evidence fake. They questioned Evan's age. They hinted that Mia should be taken back into state care. But the ledger didn't lie. More sites were discovered. More former employees spoke up. What started as one piece of land became a trail of buried waste across multiple counties. One night, Evan couldn't sleep. He walked outside the motel and sat on the curb. I wanted the easy way, he admitted. I wanted the money. Mia joined him. But then we wouldn't be us. A month later, Blackridge's stock collapsed. Executives resigned. Investigations spread beyond the state. Mr. Whitmore called with the news. They're offering a settlement, he said. Not hush money, a court-ordered one. Cleanup funds. Compensation for what your family lost? Evan closed his eyes. And the land? It stays yours. When the first bulldozer arrived to test the soil, Evan felt something strange. Relief. Not victory. Relief. The secret had done what it was meant to do. But the fight had changed them. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were standing for something. And the world finally was listening. Spring came slowly to the land. The weeds were cleared first. Then the broken boards of the old farmhouse were hauled away piece by piece. Evan worked until his hands blistered. Mia carried nails and held measuring tape like it was something sacred. They built a small house on the same foundation where the old one had stood, with wide windows facing the open field and a porch just big enough for 2 chairs and a table. The Quonset hut was no longer a shelter of fear. They scrubbed the rust, patched the holes, and turned it into a workshop. Sunlight finally reached the corners that had once hidden secrets. The settlement money paid for the cleanup, the house, and school for Mia. It wasn't millions, it wasn't flashy, but it was honest. Some nights, Evan sat on the porch and reread Henry Carter's letters. The words felt different now. They no longer sounded like apologies. They sounded like instructions. Mia changed the most. She laughed more. She walked through the field with wildflowers tucked into her jacket pocket. She talked about becoming a scientist, so nobody can poison land again and get away with it. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, Mr. Whitmore came by with the last of the legal papers. He looked older, but lighter somehow. Your grandfather would be proud, he said. Not because you fought, but because you stayed. After he left, Evan watched Mia water the small garden near the house. For most of his life, Evan had believed inheritance meant money, or property, or something you could lose if you made the wrong decision. But sitting there, he understood something new. An inheritance could also be a test, a question passed down from one generation to the next. What will you do when the truth costs you something? They had been offered an easy future. They had turned it down, and somehow that choice had given them something better. A place to belong, a story that wasn't built on silence, a home earned instead of bought. Evan looked out over the land and felt something he had never known before. Peace. Not because life was perfect, but because it was honest. And now I want to ask you something. If you were standing where Evan stood, if someone offered you money to forget the truth, if silence could make your life easier, what would you choose? Would you take the safe road or the right one? And what does home mean to you? Is it a building, a memory, a promise you refuse to break? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one because your stories matter here. And if this story moved you, even a little, if it reminded you that character is worth more than comfort, please consider subscribing to the channel. We share stories about courage, family, and the choices that define who we are. You're not just watching a story. You're becoming part of one.